Thank you, Deborah, and thank you, everybody, for coming tonight to the second of our three-part series celebrating the centennial of suffrage in New York. And thank you to my wonderful panelists here. What an honor to sit with you and talk and learn from you tonight. And it's an interesting night to be, I guess, talking about a lot of these themes that we're going to be touching on tonight, given the centennial and then also the particular climate that we're in. And so I really chewed on what I should ask you first, because in a way I find it sad that I'm going to ask this question, but I want us to articulate it very clearly, because I want to get into why it's so important to think about women in power and what it is specifically that women bring to the table. And so I want to throw that out to you first. What do women bring to the table when we think about sort of putting women in positions of power?
Good. All right. Good evening, everyone. So the first thing that comes to mind when you ask that question is I think of the fact that there are 520,000 elected offices in this country. Men make up 70% of them. We talk 520,000 elected offices. Men occupy 70% of them. Women are 51% of the population, but we're not making up 51% of the elected offices in this country. We talk about how we want a reflective democracy. So for me, that means that we need people that look like our democracy in elected office, and that includes women. And we have so many great Emerge America alums, and I see the difference every day that they make in their communities and the way that they legislate. And like, no slight to men, but women just legislate differently. We run for office to get things done, plain and simple. We say that women legislate on women's issues, but at the end of the day, they're community issues. We take care of the veterans, the homeless. We want fair pay. We want paid family leave, because we know these are the things that are going to make our communities better. When you look at women, they introduce more bills. They co-sponsor more bills. And everything runs the gamut. You know, I read a report a while ago, and it was showing that in cities where you have a lot of women in elected office, the infant mortality rate went down. That shows you something, because you have women who are making those decisions. Women are at the table. We bring a different discourse. So for me, especially in this climate, when we see what is coming out of the White House, it's important to have women's voices, because we can't let the negativity become the norm. We need to make sure that having women, diverse women from all socioeconomic backgrounds, racial backgrounds, that's what we need.
Well, I think it just follow up on that and agree with everything that was just said as it relates to women or people of color or LGBT community or disabled people or anybody who hasn't been at the table. And let's be clear, those who have been at the table built the goddamn table. You know what I mean? They only put enough seats they wanted for their friends. And they and their friends are and were straight white men who own property, was part of the original equation. And they have not done such a good job. So even if women didn't do it better and we knew we did it better, somebody else got to run the table, because they have not done that good job of running the table at all. And obviously democracy at its best is representative of who is being represented and who the citizenry is. But I think, just building on what you said, anyone who gets to the table who hasn't been there before is more, and remember, Gloria said, Steinem said, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So it really does matter, and she's very right about that. But if you haven't been there before, and this really is true for women, you're conscious of that you've never been there before. You're conscious of that your participation and your role is not just about you. It's about all the other people who are like you, and particularly those who are like you but are much younger, the children who are like you. And you carry with you what others who were in that role carried with them. The responsibility to do extraordinarily well, lest no one ever say, they, women or whomever, are not up to the job, they can't cut it. And you seek to do extraordinarily well, so the little girls or the young LGBT people who are seeing you and watching you want to aspire to the level you had, not be disappointed by that. Now, those are some kind of like pull the lens out, 30,000 foot reasons, but they all trickle down, right, to what we do and what we focus on and how we do it. And I got a little pumped up when you said infant mortality, because when I was chair of the health committee for 4 years in the city council, that and maternal mortality were one of our biggest things we focused on. And prior to my involvement as chair, we had money for that issue that got put out through the city, budget, health committee, Department of Health, et cetera. But it kind of got given largely equally to everywhere. But when you look, but we said, well, where's the biggest challenge here? And it was the South Bronx. And then we delved into the data. It was teenage pregnant girls in the South Bronx. So we redirected the money. We built out a program with experts who knew how to work with teenage girls. And people got mad. Well, why isn't, X part of Manhattan getting the money? Because you should thank God you have the lowest number, and it's not actually even on the charts. But that's the kind of way, really, almost metric and data driven before people talked about metrics, right, in the results, and who needs support and how do we give it.
It's interesting because thinking about this from a historian's perspective, I'm thinking a lot about suffragists and the way that suffragists framed their claim to the franchise, right? And early suffragists said, well, I'm a citizen, it's a universal right. And in a lot of ways, the way that suffragists actually gained the vote was by saying, well, actually, women bring something unique to the table. They bring something different to the table. And it's interesting hearing you both talk about this. I still am wondering, is there something about gender? Is it something about the particular experiences of women? Or is it that women have been denied it for so long that they are more attuned, in the same way that people of color, people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds have been denied that power for so long, that they bring a different sort of set of views to the table that are about being disenfranchised?
I don't know, and it's probably a great question to ask very kind of prominent, thoughtful, social scientists and social psychologists, et cetera. I mean that. And now I'm going to say it's a distinction without a difference, in my opinion, because in my opinion, in the context of all of this, the results are the only thing that matter. And when you look at women and women elected officials, and there are other groups you can say this about too, and maybe it's because we haven't been at the table. Maybe we watched what our mothers or our sisters or our grandmothers, went through. All of those reasons, at the end, the results are better for society, for other women, for children, for girls. So that's what matters. I do think it's relevant in looking at how we educate and motivate moving forward to understand the answer to your question. But I know I'm not smart in that way to answer it. And the idea of doing research, I would torture us. I had to do that once, not after leaving government. It's very, very hard. I'm not good at that. But it is important for someone to figure it out. But in kind of more of the, the New York City streets way of looking at it, I don't know, I don't care. It's about the results. But it does matter.
Tonight is 100 years, but when we think about it in the context of the founding of this country, it hasn't been that long. And for women of color, it really hasn't been that long. When you look at women of color, even if you look at state elected offices, mayors, less than 7% of elected officials in each of those areas, because it hasn't been that long. And it comes down to the fact that you can't be what you don't see. And we still need for women to see other women in power. I love the fact that we have this generation that is growing up and they know that a black man can be president. They know that a woman can run to be president. And that does give me hope because we'll see more young people running, but it's just also different for women when they run for office. And I say with our program, Emerge, we recruit and train women to run for office, but I let them know the one thing our program can't do is I can't take the sexism, the misogyny, the racism out of politics. I can say if you want to see less sexism in politics as an elected official, get more women at the table. You know, that's my answer to that. But we still have a long way to go to parity.
Well, and you know, I think that issue of running and the degree to which there will be, you know, sexism and misogyny and homophobia and racism. And I feel like there was a time, I mean, it's always been, but I feel like there was a time where maybe people were a little more shrouded in how they did it. They weren't quite as obvious. Well, that is gone, right? It's totally gone. And I think sometimes we can get lured into the fact of thinking, well, we see it on CNN, we see it on MSNBC, it's only happening in Washington. I gotta tell you, I was up in Peekskill over the weekend working with the One Peekskill ticket. If you know anybody in Peekskill, tell them please to go out and vote for the Democrats on the One Peekskill ticket tomorrow. There's a wonderful young African-American man who's running for mayor and a very diverse ticket of Latina and Latinos who are running for a town council. But I say this because the mayor of Peekskill has attacked the only African-American woman on the county legislature as a nasty woman, and you know, an inappropriate woman. And Andre, who's running for mayor, the present mayor has found pictures on social media of him out, you know, when he was in college or whatever, out at a party with 2 white women at his side. And this has been made into a mailer clearly designed to say, be careful of your white women in your life. Keep them away. I mean, it doesn't say that, but that's what it's saying. So it's not even just in Washington. And I don't say that to say, oh, that's so terrible. I say that to say you should run, but you should know what you're getting in for and prepare yourself. And I used to think preparing for myself for things like this meant just grit my teeth and white knuckle it and plow right through it. Because interestingly, growing up, I have a sister who's 10 years older who's a geologist, so 2 fields women of our ages don't typically go into. And my mother was very clear, not that we could be successful in what we wanted, but that we would be. And she never once let the idea of any kind of sexism enter into the equation of our lives, which I give her a lot of credit for, but both my sister and I were like, what the heck is this the first time it came up, which is absurd, but true. So I say it not to say don't do it, do it. Do it because there's sexism. Do it because there's racism. Do it because there's homophobia in the voter process. But be prepared for it.
Yes.
And have a support system of people in the political universe you're in and outside of it who can support you, help you, who you can vent at, all of that, because it isn't easy, but it has to be challenged or it will just continue to spread like the cancer it is.
Wow, I'm totally sold. You both brought up, I think, a really important theme, and that is that women are not just women, they're many other things. Many aspects go into our identities, our race, our ethnicity, our religion, our sexuality. And it's interesting, in our early, who here came to our first? Anyone here come to our first? Oh, that's so great to hear.
Look at that.
So we talked a lot about intersectionality and the way that people's experiences are shaped by many aspects of their identity and in ways that reveal very unequal power relations. And we've seen this play out with women in politics in ways that can be really divisive, in ways that can be really disheartening. Do you have thoughts on ways that women can sort of overcome these barriers to unification?
So for us at Emerge, the way our program works is it is a cohort-based model. It's 25 women, it's 6 months of training, and it is diverse. Like diversity and inclusion, at Emerge America, we're actually about equity and inclusion, because that's what we need. We have women from LGBTQ backgrounds, we have women who come from rural parts, and when they're in that room together over 6 months, they develop friendships, they develop that support system, but they also get to know why other women are running for office. And for me, it shouldn't be opposition, it's just different. And those are different voices we're going to bring. It's great if there's a woman who's running because she's secure, her kids are healthy, they have money, so she wants to focus on climate change. That's good for her. But it's also totally fine for a woman who is single without kids to run for office because she saw the undocumented mother, her neighbor, at the bus stop dropping off her kids, and she got deported. So she wants to run to fight for immigration. We need people doing climate change. We need people doing immigration, and we have to come to an understanding. It's like, we already have to fight the men. We don't need to be fighting each other. The more, the better. You know, I love it. We're to the point at Emerge where we train so many women that we have our alums running for the same position. I don't say they run against each other because they don't. They run for the same position. We're making it so that when people go to vote, you have 3 women and 1 man, or 1 man. That's what we want to be the norm. And for our alums, like one of our alums won, and her Emerge sisters were immediately there to support her. They were not trashing her, they were not bashing her, because they wanted a woman, you know, and not the man, but also they were not gonna give any ammunition to her opponent to be able to drag her down and say, well, her Emerge sister said this and that. And we need to just stop looking at it as opposition and just understand why another woman is running, because she's running for the same reasons as you. Because there's something that she cares about, there's something that motivated her, and she wants to run for office, and just listen to her and understand that and respect that. You know, you may have a differing opinion, which is fine, but especially don't knock another woman down if her platform isn't your platform. If anything, find how your platforms can correlate and how you can work together and be better. And I just think overall as a country, we've stopped listening. You know, well, I love Twitter, and on Twitter, there's this account called Trump's Feed, and it retweets all of the things that Donald Trump sees. Now, sometimes I log onto Twitter, I'm like, why is this in my feed? I'm like, I know I don't follow this, and I get confused. I'm like, oh, I'm following this account, but it helps me understand why he goes on TV and says the things that he says, because I'm seeing them. And I fundamentally agree with his mindset, but I also understand, because this is what he's seeing, this is what he believes.
Something you just said is really, really important and powerful, and so I just want to amplify it, which is when you listed the women who are part of Emerge, you listed the issues they were running for or run on, the things they care about as their number one. Obviously, there's other things they care about. If you had a room of the equivalent number of male candidates as you had in that Emerge training, you wouldn't have the equivalent number of issues. You wouldn't. Because when men come to you and say, or come to me and say, I want to run for office, I say, great. Any, good, thoughtful, intelligent, progressive person, great, why? Well, because I want to be a member of the city council. I want to be on the New York State Senate. No, I got that, right? So, but why? Because I could do a good job, because I'd be good. It takes many questions till I start going, you're not getting what I'm talking about. What is the issue you care about? And that's a jarring question. It's for most men running for office, even Democratic progressive men, it's not where it starts. It's not their mission to fix an issue, to help people, to uplift people. It's about what they think is best for them and their career.
Yes.
And it's not even, I went to a funeral today for a woman, a very affluent New York City philanthropist, but Joan Tisch, her biggest contribution was during the AIDS crisis, walking into GMHC, which kind of very few people of that stature were doing in New York, without identifying herself and saying, how can I be of service?
That's the word, isn't it?
How can I be of service? That's not what you hear from men
It's not.
when they are running for office, as opposed to you said those words in different ways from your emerged sisters. How can I be of service? So that's really important for us to know as voters when we are at forums, as leaders when candidates come to us to ask for our endorsements, right? The what is the issue versus what position do you want? So that's really important. On the question of intersectionality, I think, well, seeing the connection, seeing that that exists, seeing that's real is in some ways, to me, one of the most critical things. Because although at WIN, Women in Need, 92% of the families that we house in shelter are led by single women, because that's the nature of poverty. I will never, ever know what their lives are like. I really never will know. They honor me with telling me their stories. They honor me with allowing WIN to use the information of their lives as part of an advocacy effort. But I can never know what it's like to sleep in this shelter for maybe 15 months with your children. Nonetheless, all of the things before that brought you there. But often I think men think they do know.
Yeah.
They think the tour of the shelter, they got it, you know? And recognizing you'll never really know. Recognizing that everyone is different and their experiences are different and those differences should be honored and held up. And being grateful and humble when people will share their stories and ask you to stand with them in their advocacy when it's about their personal lives is really important. And also accepting, and I'm a big mouth, so this can be hard for me, that not in every room, and this is terrible grammar, you know, in some rooms, I'm running the agenda. This is what we're doing, but not in every room. And I may have an idea even could add a lot. But not every room is the right space for me to put my hand up and say that there's other ways to communicate and be helpful, and you just have to respect that. Like at WIN, tragically, but it's not surprising, when sometimes, more often than not, I'll say, when we have families come where there is a man and a woman heading that family, the man will perpetrate domestic violence against the woman, who's usually the mother, in the shelter. And I would like nothing more than to have that man arrested immediately and kicked out of the shelter. But it's not my decision. And often our staff gets really angry at the women. They don't express it. And you gotta feel what you feel. But you also have to recognize that you can't stand with people if you are gonna blame or shame or express in an angry way your lack of understanding and even your lack of empathy at that moment, because all it does is create distance between us. Now, we can argue it's just distance based on progressive values versus Donald Trump's, but it's still distance. And when you leave a vacuum, nothing good ever fills it in.
Well, I think you used the exact right word. I mean, what I hear you both articulating is a politics of empathy, and empathy that results from listening and really being with people rather than sort of viewing them from afar. And that's that's very empowering to me, and I would imagine to our audience. But on the other hand, then I look at the world that we live in, and I say, politics of empathy. Oh my God! Like, where can that exist in the landscape, in the political landscape that seems to be sort of the world we are in today?
You know,
Well, empathy. I'm sorry. Empathy. It doesn't equal weakness. You know, I said recently at an event for Senator Gillibrand, she is, and I say this is a great compliment. She is empathetically as tough as nails, right? That's great. Empathy isn't weakness. Empathy should be the foundation of the most significant, powerful, tough as any other battles we've ever fought and will fight. And I think America does want empathy. They just don't know what it looks like anymore. And it's our job to model that as much as we can in different ways.
But we can bring that empathy into elected office. You know, the story you told me about the women in the shelter is we have an alum out of Maryland. I love her. When she applied to our program, she was actually going through a divorce. You know, that divorce turned physical, you know, and it became a domestic violence situation. She ended up being in a shelter with her kids, but the entire time she was still going through our training program. And now that she's in elected office, what does she advocate for? Women in shelters, domestic violence. And her colleagues have empathy because you're just like me, but you went through that. And it shows that anyone can run for elected office. Women, when they run for office, they win at the same rates as men. We're just not running at the same numbers as men. That's part of why we're not getting closer to parity. So when you're sitting next to me at the dais, you have the same nameplate, you're wearing the same pin, we're gonna go back to the same office. It makes it a lot harder to discount me and discount my story because I'm just no longer a name on a paper in your briefing book. I'm no longer just that woman who was in the corner when you're touring the homeless shelter. I am that person. And that is also how we get more empathy when women run for elected office and they share their stories. Like our model at Emerge is when we focus on public speaking and communications, we use the storytelling method. Because also telling your story makes you authentic, and people want authentic candidates. When they see something that makes you just like me, another alum, she always wanted to run for office, but she ended up losing her home during, you know, the mortgage crisis. Like a lot of people, and she was so embarrassed. She's like, no one's ever gonna vote for me. They're gonna be like, well, you can't manage your money, like you lost your home. And we helped her tell her story, and her story was, yes, I had to declare bankruptcy. I lost my home like several of my other neighbors. It's embarrassing, but that's why I'm running for elected office, because I don't want to see this ever happen to anyone else again. She was authentic about it, she owned it, and she kicked out a 20-year incumbent. So, you know. So for me, like Chris said, it's not weakness. It's just showing that our fellow humans are human and we should care about what they're going through.
Okay, I want to talk about another identity that complicates this a little bit, and that is conservative women. A lot of the politics that we've been articulating here are a progressive politics, a politics of social justice. But where do conservative women come into this conversation? Is our goal to empower all sides of the political spectrum if the people who are running are women?
Well, I think a pre-question to that question
A clarification.
is, what is conservatism? I don't know, this word's hard to say, or maybe just for us.
Right,
It's hard to say today, right? What does it mean to be a Republican today? You know, you think back to some of who was one of the greatest progressives of the United States Senate, right? The lion of the Senate, Ted Kennedy. He undoubtedly passed, if not the most, but one of the highest numbers of bipartisan bills where he and the Republican name after his, or maybe before, but it seemed like Kennedy always kept them after him, really wrote those bills together. Now, I get that those days of bipartisanship at the moment are living in limbo, and that those kind of Republicans are if they're still around, frightened, or maybe not there. But I just want us to kind of hold that memory in our mind, because that's important. I mean, I'm a Democrat 1,000 gazillion percent. I remember once my father got a poll call, and I hear him say, the Democrat, the Democrat, the Democrat, the Democrat, the Democrat. And then he said, ma'am, let's just speed this up. If you put an axe murderer on the Democratic Party line, that's who I'm voting for, because that's how good people were raised. Click. So, not a worldly view for my father, but made the point. But I do believe in bipartisanship. And I do believe that a bipartisan government is a better government. Do I think having more women in government generally, kind of absent of the moment we're in, regardless of party, is a good thing? Am I grateful that Susan Collins is in
Yeah.
Senate for Maine? You better believe it, right? So generally, yes, I think having more women are better. I'm interested in furthering the political discourse in a way that there can be a political discourse, and if voices are going to be heard, they be women's voices. I'm not personally interested in spending a lot of my time or capital on helping Republican women get elected unless we strategically know that's the absolutely best we can do in a district.
Right.
But overall, I think it's important, and I think would drive the Republican Party back to a better place, but it just doesn't sound like fun to me.
Yeah. So at our merge, we only recruit and train Democratic women. I tell people I sleep fine just at night doing that. But when I do look at the Senate, I am glad that there are conservative women there because they have done the right thing. Like even when they're getting like gold dangled in front of them saying, well, we won't, impact your state, they're still doing what's right. And again, like looking at our alums, when I talked about how they introduce more bills, they co-sponsor more bills, they're doing that with Republican women. And Republican women will actually tell them, I'm so excited that you're here, because if you introduce that, that actually gives me leverage to be able to sign on. Like they can actually do things that they can't do because their leadership doesn't want them to do it. And guess who the leadership is? Men. Sorry. I really do love men. We're so glad you're here. You're great. So for them, that's a good thing too. Like Chris said, I'm not going to go out and recruit and train Republican women, but there are Republican women who do tend to lean, more on the Democratic side. They're more moderate. And if they get elected to office and they can still work with Democratic women, that's great. And again, it goes back to listening and understanding. And if they want to listen and understand, there's no reason why we shouldn't work together.
I mean, I'm sorry, I can't remember her name, and I feel terrible about that. The senator from Alaska.
Murkowski.
Thank you. I mean, they basically said to her, Alaska will get its own Medicare, Medicaid.
Mm-hmm. The gold, the shiny gold, yeah.
And she said no. And I suspect she said no for a number of reasons. One, she didn't believe them, which was a good impulse. Two, even if they started with it, it wasn't sustainable. Mm-hmm. And three, although her job specifically was to care about Alaska, your job in the United States Senate is to care about America.
Yes, everybody.
And if Alaska got, that meant others who were getting less got even less to bring the resources for Alaska. And I think I believe you don't have to think that hard to get to the answer, would a man senator have done that? Mm-hmm. No. I would argue that even most Democratic male senators would have taken the deal. Mm-hmm. Maybe not if Donald Trump gave it, but you know what I'm saying.
So going back 100 years ago today, when people talked about suffrage, they called it an issue of feminism. Feminism was part of the women's suffrage movement. Today, that term has gotten fractured, co-opted, misused. And I want to ask you, is feminism still an important and viable part of political life?
So I have a lot of feelings about this. Even, one of my final papers I wrote in grad school was on feminism. And yes, feminism is important, but only if it's going to include everyone. I was at the women's convention, I think it was the last week, I can't remember, I travel a lot, y'all. But I was talking to one of my colleagues, and she went to one of the state breakout sessions, and she actually said a woman got up and was upset that there were so many sessions about women of color, about LGBTQ people, about immigration. She didn't like it because her feminism was centered around white women. And I actually have a shirt, I won't say what it says a cuss word, but it's pretty much like, screw your feminism if it doesn't include me. That's how I feel. because it's not feminism. There was a whole convention, and because it was not centered around you, what you thought feminism should be, what it should look like, you wanted to discount an entire event when the organizers of that convention were diverse. There were LGBTQ women, there were Muslim women, there were women of color, because that's what feminism should look like. You shouldn't be bothered by it. So yes, feminism is definitely still important if it's going to be inclusive, if it's going to have intersectionality. But if you're just saying feminism to say feminism and I'm a feminist, like, you can miss me with that, you know. I'm not down for it. So I'm gonna stop now because I'll get into my paper. So yeah, I'm going.
And not for nothing, why didn't that woman just look at the agenda? And if she didn't like the breakout groups or the workshops, don't buy the ticket to Detroit. You know what I mean? Because what did she add? Just don't come. But, you know what I mean? No one needed you here yet, that meeting, I'm fairly sure at that moment. But, you know, I agree with a lot of what's been said. And look at the history of feminism and how it played out and where it started. And how it started is not to show disrespect to those who led the feminist movement and facilitated so much good. But we cannot pretend feminism and its structures, not in its individuality for men and women, has a challenged background. It was extremely defined by white women. It was led by white women. Those were white, straight women who at times spoke in crystal clear language that they were not interested in lesbians or bisexual women being at the table. They had no interest in diversity. They thought their diversity of being a woman, born a woman, I don't think there's any interest to try to understand transgender women, was enough. Now you can make an argument for it was a moment in time and blah, 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 but it's painful. Right? It is painful for me to know that a movement that was supposed to encompass all women and girls, that those lesbian activists who came before me had to fight like dogs to get at the table, had to form their own groups, that women who will go down in history as some of the most important leaders looked on them with scorn and said incredibly homophobic things about them. That is the truth as it relates to LGBT women and women of color. And that's a reality. And we all have to face it and then move forward with that reality. The bigger problem is I don't think we've particularly seen, and I could be wrong, those who are still fighting with us, who were part of that original part of the movement. We've seen very few of them step forward and say, this was a mistake. I regret this. That doesn't make it go away, but it helps. And there have been some, absolutely, but overall, no. Two, less significantly than one, it seems to, and I hate that we talk about branding in politics that way nowadays. I'm like, I want to scream, we're not a pack of gum. But if you want to win, there is some truth to that.
There's identity politics.
And the brand of feminism, set aside the history, doesn't seem to be catching with a younger generation of women, even white women, right? And so we have to recognize that. That's not to reject the past, that's not to say good wasn't done, but is that a branding that is working moving forward, which is not to say that women running as women, for girls, for our society, is something we want to shy away from. You know, when I ran for mayor, there was a lot of conversation, don't be too this, don't be too that, don't be too tough, don't be too soft, don't be too, which I tried to follow the direction of, and you might have noticed the race didn't work out that well. And it wasn't that much fun, right? So if you're running and you're a woman, everyone has noticed. Do you know what I mean? So go for it, be it, do it, you know? Which may be a very feminist idea, and I think that's great. but we need to be mindful of the limitations and the history of feminism and how to strategically use that and it most productively in our efforts to move the agenda of all women and all girls and all communities that have not been at the table. Because if it's, we're talking about poverty is a women's issue, but I want as many resources for the little boy in that household as well as the little girls in that household.
See, you hit on something I talked about in my paper. And I did put that I felt that feminism was at risk for the younger generation unless it changed and unless it became more inclusive. And that wasn't even me just reading in the books. These are just my observation, because kids today, the majority of them are growing up in more diverse societies. So when they hear someone constantly saying feminism, 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 but, well, you don't look like me and you don't live in my community and none of your friends look like me, I'm going to think that feminism isn't for me. So it definitely does need a rebranding. And I'm very glad that, the women who organized the Women's March, look different, because one of the trainings I did at the Women's Convention was for their youth track.
Oh, great.
And that room was diverse. There were kids from all backgrounds. They look like America, but they felt welcome because the women who organized it also look like them.
All right, I want to leave time for our audience to ask questions, but I'm going to ask you guys one more question. And I just blatantly stole it from somebody, but I thought it was such a good question that I'm going to use it tonight. I'd like to hear one thing in the past few months that has caused you the most despair related to women in politics, and the one thing that has brought you the most hope.
I think it's something that always gives me despair is women who want to run for office but don't think they can do it. Because women, we always put this baggage on ourselves. We're like, well, am I smart enough? Am I pretty enough? Do I have the right job? Do I have to get married? Because there's just this picture perfect, of what you have to be. And there is no perfect candidate. If there was, all of our elected officials would be the same. There are great candidates, but there's no perfect candidate. And I just want for women to know that they are already wonderful and that they should run. And what gives me hope is women seeing that. And, it's election eve, and tomorrow we have 126 Emerge alums on the ballot.
Huh?
That gives me hope.
Yeah. Tragically, and I would usually make the joke and say, it's hard for me to pick the moment that's given me the most despair because I'm Irish, and our life is informed by the hunger could come again at any moment. You can't really assume, but it's that on steroids now, given the president. I can't pick a moment. I do, as was mentioned in my introduction, CNN and MSNBC sometimes, and I often leave those panels very discouraged. Not so much by the comments that are necessarily made by those who I'm on the panel with, but by the clear, by it being so clear that their comments are just talking points that they've digested, and that they won't or can't allow one brain cell to engage in an actual conversation with somebody who is an adversary or an independent person, the anchor or a journalist who doesn't particularly have a dog in the fight. That to me is incredibly depressing, because I really subscribe to the belief still that if you get people in a room together long enough and talking, if you're a good listener, there'll be that moment, that miraculous moment where people in different words have in essence said the same thing. And that if you can seize on that moment, anything is possible. And it's trying to hold on to that belief sometimes with these panelists. I had a very unfortunate moment last week. I was on with Ed Martin, who is the head of the Phyllis Schlafly Foundation, and we were talking about, it might have been better if I didn't know that, because we were talking about the Mueller investigation, and he started making all these very clear references to J. Edgar Hoover, and I was, it's bad. At one point, I was like, yeah, honey. And someone said, you did the honey on telly? You can't do the honey on see. You can't do that. But I did. I lost it. I gave him the honey. Whatever you say, honey. All righty, honey. Not good. But
Sometimes you just gotta honey people.
sometimes you just got to honey people. You know what I mean? You just, you gotta. The most hopeful is the women at Win. I was touring a person on our shelter today, and Ms. Pam, the shelter director in East Harlem, I said, tell her about Ms. Alave. And Ms. Alave allows us to use her last name, who was the first homeless woman I met at Win. And she had a tough story, tough domestic violence story, a little girl, got to Win and was like, I'm going to get out, this is going to be great, I'm going to get out of shelter, fell into a deep depression, which is understandable. Ms. Pam and her staff said to her, Ms. Lave, you don't look well. And she's like, no, I'm fine, I feel good. And they're like, no, you used to, have clean clothes on, and used to, Zoe had bows in her hair, and you look like something's wrong, come see us. And she said, I never would have thought you noticed me. I never would have thought you noticed how I looked. She went on to leave shelter. She works for the Parks Department. She is in horticultural training. She got a license to drive the really big Parks Department trucks. She moved back to a permanent home in Staten Island, which is where she wanted to be, was in Staten Island, and is doing incredibly well. She was a domestic violence survivor who fled her partner, went to her cousins, he found her there, beat her very badly, and she said, I can't put, not like me, I can't put my cousin in this position. So it's stories like that where you think, whatever our own list is, and we all have our own lists, I pray to God no one's as bad as Miss Alave's was once, and now Miss Alave is a union member, has health benefits, her daughter has health benefits. I mean, that's the power of people, but more, it's the power of women.
Yes.
And I get the great honor of seeing that in all of its different ways in the work at Win, and it's just, to me, that's what it's all about.
Ashanti, Christine, thank you so much. This is amazing.
Yeah.
And no doubt the audience has some questions, so we will be bringing around a microphone. Yes, raise your hands. I see one person right here.
Thank you very much. What I'm thinking is in terms of how do women have a greater influence on the very, very large percentage of women who voted for our current president. I didn't realize it until I heard what a huge percentage of women did not vote for Hillary and voted for our current president. I do hear, of course, that getting more women into politics to win could have some impact, but do you have any thoughts regarding that?
Oh, so many thoughts on this one, too. I've been talking about this one since Election Day. So for me, obviously, I'm an African-American woman. 94% of us voted for Hillary Clinton.
Right.
We literally tried to save this country.
My people, we let you down. It's my people.
Sorry.
It's a fact. I mean, the lesbians, we were good, but the white women, we cratered. Crater.
So for me, there's not a lot of people to talk to. Trump, he has those women like Diamond and Silk. I call them polyester and rhinestone because I'm petty, but, they're going to be them. It is really the white women. You have to talk to your cousins. You have to talk to your sisters. You have to talk to your friends. and I work for a women's organization. I want to see women elected, obviously, but I still have to be realistic and know that a woman isn't going to vote for a woman just because she's a woman. You know, people are still going to vote for their party lines, and I'm very honest with people. I don't have a problem with the fact that it's a Republican president in the White House. I'm realistic. I know it's going to switch off and on. I have a problem that it's him. He is my problem. I have a problem with women being able to go and push that button after everything that he said. That you push that button after he talked about sexually assaulting women. That you push that button after he was on a stage and called another woman a nasty woman and just like followed her around. You voted for him after there were clips about comments he's even said about his own daughters. You voted for that. You were okay with that. And that's what I have a problem with. So like white women, you gotta talk. You gotta talk to your people. I'm sorry, I'm just being very honest here. And I talked earlier about listening. You have to let them know that, okay, that is not okay, because kids are watching that. There are kids who are now being bullied in school because Donald Trump does it, so it's okay. There are kids who don't understand why Harvey Weinstein and all these other people, all these bad things are happening to them, but nothing happened to the president. Because people pushed a button and said it was okay for him to do that. So that's where it happens. You gotta talk to him. Election day's tomorrow. You got tonight, we got some time. Talk to your people, and after Election Day, 2018, 2019, 2020. Because it's the only way we're gonna get this country back on track. I'm not giving up on my country. This is all temporary. That's how I look at it. But we still need to make sure that we're talking, so this definitely does become temporary in 2020. I don't wanna be having this conversation again in 2021. I really don't. I'm gonna be angry. I probably won't get invited to a lot of panels because I'm gonna cuss a lot, because I'm angry. So that's where it starts, with talking to people.
I agree with all of that. I agree with all of that what you just said. And it really was white women. And it was particularly even white women, I think the statistics are, who've had more education than high school. And it is about talking to them, you know, and it is about, we had white women in my own family who, I don't know if they voted for Trump, but they certainly were flirting with him. And they never told me they didn't. And I made a very clear point, calmly, which is not always the case, what that meant to me, what that meant to their Aunt Kimmy, what that, and it was a man, but what that would have meant to their late Uncle Tony, who was a gay man. What must that look like to their daughters? And sometimes we'll say, well, you need to talk about the facts. I think you need to talk about it personal. You know, and I had someone in my family said, well, but, well, but we need to change. Well, but let's see what happens. I said, do we need a change where our marriage could never have happened? Do we need a change, you know, back to what it was like for Uncle Tony in the 70s when he didn't tell anybody? You know, do we need this change? Do we need that change? And that makes people, because it's easy, tragically, not excusable, but easy for people to get stuck in the sound bites and the 147 characters. So that's one thing. It's talking and not putting the talking in a time frame of only around Election Day, right? That's another thing I would add. Two, and I'm a huge, huge Hillary fan. I have every message she ever left me, like, saved in my phone. I'm actually a Hillary geek. And I say this because I didn't run that great a campaign for mayor. We need to run better campaigns. As much fodder as there was and is in not being him, the way you catch people's attention is by telling them more, making them remember Donald Trump. But the way you move that attention to support is by doing what Harvey Milk always said, by giving people hope. People have enough anger at whatever ways they think they have been wronged in their lives by America. We need to move them to hope-based action by giving them candidates and campaigns that inspire them. Why did the most people ever vote for President Obama? Because, for a lot of reasons, but at the core, the first time, he was inspiring. He wanted you to be, he moved you to want to be your better self. Now, not everyone is going to be the orator he was, but there's lots of ways for candidates to do that we have historically not done well as Democrats. And all of that is what we have to do.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm wondering if you could comment on reproductive rights issues and choice issues and what that's doing to women who are voting and running. And I want to make an observation in case people aren't aware of it, but there's an element in the Trump tax bill that is really an anti-choice thing where they're giving personhood to an unborn child is the word that they're using.
They get like a deduction or something. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Seriously,
Right.
a fetus gets a deduction.
But back to the issue of
Right.
pro-choice and reproductive rights, if you could comment on that.
Well, you know, I'm on the board of the National Institute of Reproductive Health Action Fund, and the big elections matter in choice, but the little elections
Yeah.
matter too. Because you're seeing cities and towns and states pass protective legislation, right? As we've done in New York City and New York State for a long time. And then you're seeing cities and towns and states who believe the courts will rule in their favor, not always rightly or correctly, or there won't be much attention because the president is theoretically on their side, pass really, really bad laws, right? And the anti-choice movement is of long-standing, it's well-funded, and it's tragically smart. So they're finding moments like the one you so rightly drew attention to, knowing there'll be so much else wrong that people will think about. I think choice is another issue, not like feminism, where we need to think about how we present it and how we talk about it to
Yes.
make it real and accessible, but how we also do that in a way that includes all women and all families, right? Which has historically not been the case. Who has been the face of choice? Straight, white, middle or upper middle class women. We need to change that dynamic. And I'll give you two examples. At NIRH last year, we honored some independent abortion providers in Georgia. 3 women running a clinic, I mean, amazing, against horrible threats, et cetera, right? Those are the people we need to hold up, not necessarily the folks who, you know, otherwise are kind of the choice celebrities. 2, when I started at WIN, we have a shelter in Astoria. And the people who were there before me were doing great work, and do great work. Most, they're still with us. The healthcare provider to that shelter was one of the health providers on a long list of health providers given by the city. It was close, Catholic Charities. Now, I almost lost my mind. Now, there's a lot of things I could say about this, but everyone was so focused on the immediate medical needs of the mothers and children, no one took a step back to say, whoa, they're not going to give us everything we want. So they're not our healthcare provider there at that shelter or any shelter anymore. Now, that's not to say Planned Parenthood is, right? But it's a place that has the full complement of medical services, information, and choices, right? And we have made available, with no pressure, reproductive health services on site as well. With less, honestly, of a view, in my opinion, around our mothers or daughters having access to abortion, but just having a conversation, right, about safe sex practices. So I think it's really important, but I think we have successfully been co-opted by the opposition to be boiled down to an issue that is hard, that is not fully what we are about, and very hard to win in the PR wars, and the choice movement in no insignificant part having grown out of the original feminist movement has those same issues we discussed before, and we have to grapple with that. And we need to get some good packagers, so to speak, or branders, because most women don't really know from the word choice.
Right.
If they're younger than 40 nowadays.
Yeah. So one of my mentors is a reverend, like strong Democrat. And she says that when I talk to my congregation about this, I talk about it as a health care need, that this is health care. And that's how I talk to my community. Like my sister-in-law, she personally doesn't believe in abortion. Those are her religious views, but she always votes for Democrats because she says, I'm not going to tell another woman what to do with her body. And that's fine. That doesn't make her less of a person. It doesn't make me love her less. Those are her religious views. I respect them, but she still has love for other women. And I think that's where we're at. This continues to be used as a wedge issue, like the wedge issue. And frankly, President Obama said it, his legacy was on the line. He said it multiple times, and now we're seeing it. You know, and this is one of those issues. I had the opportunity to be at a women's meeting, and Elise Hogue from NARAL was there, and she actually said the majority of the people in this country do believe in choice. That's a fact. But it's like we still have this conversation because there's elected people in office, mainly men, who want to make that decision for women. So it really is about, we need to start talking about this differently. We need to take back the narrative because it is a healthcare issue. For me, I have a pre-existing condition. If I ever got pregnant, I probably would have to choose between my life and the life of that child, but that's my decision to make with my partner and my doctor. Like, no one else knows my life. They can't tell me what's best. So that's why I personally believe in choice. But I think once we actually figure out, you know, how to reframe this discussion, it will be much better. You know, I was talking to one of our EDs, and she said she was actually having an argument with a woman who was applying for the class because she said that she was anti-choice. And she was talking to her, she's like, no, you're actually pro-choice. She's like, no, I'm anti-choice. She's like, no, what you just said, you're pro-choice, because like she didn't even understand it. Exactly, I know. She's like, no. She's like, she had to give her honey.
Yeah, oh yeah,
you know,
it happens. It
and
happens.
just be like, look. So again, once she framed it as health care instead of like abortion, she got it.
Oh,
Oh, hi.
You're in the poorly lit section, so.
I know I'm getting all of this light.
But I'm not a shy wallflower.
Good.
So my wife and I are longtime Democrats, and this morning we were watching Morning Joe. And it was a great conversation because tomorrow there's a good chance that the Democratic nominee for governor in New Jersey and also in Virginia are going to get shellacked.
We're going to get shellacked.
Shellacked.
Well, Murphy's not going to get shellacked.
And well, let me tell you how the conversation went this morning on Morning Joe. Remember, we are ardent Democrats. So the conversation came up about this whole thing with sanctuary cities and how there are ads being run by Gillespie in Virginia and also by the Republican in New Jersey trying to show that these thugs who are perhaps undocumented, have committed murder or crimes or whatever, and that the Democratic candidate is tolerating it and saying we're going to be sanctuary city, sanctuary state. So Joe and Mika and some of the other panelists say, you know, the Democrats have got to get it together or we're going to go down the tubes again, because it seems that it's hard for people, for Democrats to say, listen, if you are documented or undocumented, if you commit a crime against another person and are violent against another person, you're toast, you're history. And that should be the overriding consideration, not whether you're documented or not, but have you joined a gang, have you committed a felony, have you committed a crime? So I thought, gee, that's good. And Joe Scarborough said, who's the Republican? He said, until Democrats get it together and are not afraid to get out there and say that we will not tolerate crime or abuse or violence, nothing's going to change. So with that, Christine Quinn, I was just blown away when I just heard you comment that you were in one of your shelters and a man struck his wife and was violent towards her, and your inclination was, that's it, out of here. But you didn't do anything because you didn't want to upset.
That's not what I said, sir. What I said is, it's not my decision.
It's not your decision.
I don't have the legal, forget moral authority, that's a different question. I do not have the legal authority, because that woman is in a homeless shelter that the organization I work for runs, I don't have the legal authority to tell her she has to arrest someone. And if he is not arrested, we don't have the legal authority to remove him from the shelter. So before you even get into what I should or shouldn't do because I want to do it, it's a moot point. It would be illegal for me to do that. I cannot do that. And the charge, whatever one thinks, just to get the nuts and bolts, the arrest wouldn't happen. The police department couldn't do it without a complainant. I wasn't struck. And if for some reason the officer did it, the arrest would not hold.
Thank you for clarifying that.
But I want to say something else. I'm against crime as a Democrat, and I don't say that lightly. And I'm against criminals. I want our justice system to be one of rehabilitation, but I also recognize there are criminals. I don't believe we have that. But there are criminals who can't be rehabilitated. Many of WIN's shelters are in places all across the city of income levels of different amounts that have inappropriately high crime rates. Those high crime rates in New York City, and in fact the data says across the country, those crimes are not being perpetrated by people who are undocumented in any significant portion. So what we need not do as Democrats is, in our zeal to win, fall into the traps they want us to fall into. Mm-hmm. We could take of the 40,000 or whatever NYPD officers and dedicate 38,000 of them to following up on the undocumented criminals in the city of New York, and they would have a lot of time to sit in Starbucks because they are not the criminal. And winning matters, but facts matter. And you can only win, in my opinion, sustainably, because we're in a blip in history, if you're based on the facts. And we also can't let them, and I have been led down this road at times on television, dog whistle in a way to us that causes us to react irrationally or incorrectly, as is the case with undocumented. And I just want to say one last fact, because when I was Speaker, we did do a piece of legislation, that is law, that said when an undocumented person gets taken to Rikers, we can't tell ICE what to do when they're at Rikers, but we can tell the Department of Corrections what to do. So we set a long list of charges, which are not convictions, for which you could not take the arrestee to the ICE table in Rikers, and it kind of works like that. So I just also want us to factually remember there's a felony and there's felonies and there's felonies, right? Not every felony is a violent crime. Not every felony is actually a crime that otherwise one would largely go to jail for. I am not minimizing felonies, but it's important for us to understand the technicality of that word, because it took us months in the council to go through every charge to make sure we weren't in a collateral damage way, including sex workers, but not including pimps, that kind of a thing.
No, and I want to follow up on that because Chris hit it on the head. That was something that was used to divide Democrats. So I live in Virginia, work in D.C., and
how is it going really down there?
So it's going to be close, which is why, if you know people in Virginia, call your people, you got time. But the minute Ralph said Virginia won't be a sanctuary city, he lost endorsements from Democratic groups and progressive groups. And Republicans were running wild with it. They're like, look, it's like he's losing support. One of the things that still gets me is after the election, people were like, oh, this is about economic anxiety. No. When you look at these flyers, several of the flyers coming out of Virginia are against our emerge women, particularly our women of color. No, these are dog whistles. It's not economic anxiety. They're setting up an us versus them, and they're saying you got to choose a side. And we have to not let them do that to us, because that's them playing identity politics. They always want to say, oh, Democrats and their identity politics. There's also white identity politics. And that's what they're doing.
I think we have time for one more question.
And I think the cameraman.
I know, we can do two. If
They
there's two
always get
hands
a
up, you always get one, yeah.
Hi. I just want to give a reference to an article that really was good for me, and I wanted to share it with everybody. It's by Amanda Hess. I don't know if you all know her, but she has this article called "The Dream and the Myth of the Woman's Vote." It's excellent, so if you get a chance to look at it, please look it up. But there's one thing she says, I just want to do a little quote. She says that, oh boy. I had underlined it, so now it's a little. I'm sorry.
No, no rush.
And I wanted, it would go along with Christine. It says that the root of, bear with me, guys.
At this point, I would have hit the wrong button, would be looking
I
at
did,
my
I hit the
shopping
wrong-
list.
While you're doing that, I do have a question while I'm looking for that. In the meantime, I wanted to want your opinion on the Constitution Convention. And it's,
So that's on the
That's
ballot tomorrow, the Constitutional Convention. I would urge everyone to vote no. Are there changes we need to make in this state? Yes. Are those that could theoretically be done at a Constitutional Convention? Yes. Are most of those achievable by getting rid of the so-called independent Democratic conference in the state Senate and having Democrats control the state Senate, choice issues and others? Yes. A constitutional convention right now in New York, particularly the way it is structured in this question, is very dangerous and will lead to more negatives than positives. So really, and a lot of big forces are for yes. The PBA is really pushing on yes. So, and some others. So I would urge folks to spread the word to vote no tomorrow. If anybody knows, there's a question, I was looking at the questions yesterday and I didn't get to research them all, but there's one about allowing jurisdictions to set aside properties for their use, which sounded like a good environmental thing, but I'm nervous maybe it's a way to set aside property for development. So if you know the answer, see me after the panel, please.
I have the quote
Get
now. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
It says, but the suffragists, but the suffragists who fought for women's right to vote were invested in enfranchising a particular kind of woman. Their pitch for women's political consciousness was rooted not in the collective experience of women, of American womanhood, but in the image of white feminist virtue. Many of the white suffragists pointedly ignored the women of color, blah, 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 blah. Now, going on, she says that not only did they ignore that, there also was a combination of working class women that were working in factories, so they also would consider them not part of the women's movement. So I think the 53% that did not, I think that it's ingrained in the suffrage movement that there has always been a separation. So I think that we need something to do with womanhood. What is that? And bring women together. Thank you.
I agree. You know, I know we're moving to one last question, but thank you for sharing that. I just want to flag a race that's going to happen after tomorrow. And it's for the Senate seat that Jeff Sessions held. And there is a man running, but talk about inspiring and talk about someone
my
who
gosh.
I've never spoken to him about it, but from the way he lives his life, really
amazing.
gets intersectionality, and that's a man by the name of Doug Jones. Go to his website. There is a not so long video there of what his history is as a civil rights lawyer. I don't want to watch it. You will be inspired. That would be the answer to the earlier question. And don't forget about the race. It's in December, the election, right? Yeah. December 12th. So send money, support, spread the word. This guy's the real deal, and we need to support him.
I mean, if you don't know about him, again, love men, he is just so phenomenal. And when you watch these videos, it brings me to tears. And it lets you know that there are still people running for elected office to do good in this country, not to just be somebody, to say I'm a city councilman, but to really do good.
One hell of a mother. Maybe two. Maybe he was that lucky, so.
Hi.
Yes. Yeah.
Hi. I wanted to ask, and anybody can answer this question. I know and understand that pretty much in all these situations where people are looking for certain resources or accessibility to certain services, we tend to forget where we're trying to get the rights to get these services and rights to, be able to sit in the same space or use the same space as other people come from, or why we ask those certain groups of people, for those rights or freedoms. When do you think, just fast forward the question, when do you think people will start to draw their attention closer to the currency and to who's printing the currency and what it's actually worth? In regards to accessibility and the people that are lobbying for certain, spaces to be kept private, or for keeping certain services to be kept private or privatized. When do you think people will start to draw their attention to that instead of just the faces that are in political positions or leadership positions or the genders of the people that are in those positions, and start to focus on that? Because there are so many people, that are coming into these leadership positions, but they have to, pretty much respond to the people that are sponsoring them, or the companies and entities that are sponsoring them. So whether you be a woman, or a black, or a brown, or whatever color man, you have to answer to an organization or an entity or an individual who has that control over their, currency or business or whatever that's sponsoring you. So when do you think, or what do you think people should do in regards to that? Thank you.
I think what people need to do in response to that, which I think is not a full answer, but a partial answer to your question, is recognize the power that they have as voters and donors and activists, right? So in New York City, I'm incredibly proud of the really aggressive public financing system we have. And it was changed less to focus on the citywide offices, but the local offices. So, and the way we used to talk about it was so we could make it so every block association president, every head of the PTA, every baseball or soccer or softball coach in New York City could run for office because small donations from New Yorkers were so amplified with public funds. Two, I think we need to do what you did and talk about and recognize the interests that are behind elected officials, but also state that as a fact because it's a fact, but then also amplify and focus on the solutions. Public financing for local elections and citywide elections in the most expensive media market in the country. Bernie Sanders' campaign. I was a big Hillary supporter, but Bernie Sanders raised his money in small dollars. I think the average gift was something like $27 or something. So there has been a way of doing it, fundraising. That leaves us in a position where we often have to think about who was behind the check. But there is the power in a lot of different ways now not to do that. And if we can support people more aggressively who are raising their money that way, we'll pull back from being so beholden to other interests?
So for me, our women, they're either running against incumbents or they're running for open seats. And their opponents, the majority of the time, raise more money than them. They get heavily outspent. And when I'm saying heavily outspent, I'm talking $600,000. But they still win because they're fueled by people. And it's, again, like Chris said, we need to talk about the power that people have. And because there's big money everywhere, no one realizes that if you get 25 people in a room and they give $25, that's a lot of money for a campaign. That can be lit, that can be ads, that can be people knocking doors. It's water for volunteers.
And in New York, each one of those $25 is matched by 7 public dollars.
Yeah.
That's power.
Right, because it's not just voting, it's also, are you helping knock doors? Are you helping canvass? Are you giving that little bit of money? And we talked about Bernie, but it was Obama who started it.
Oh, right.
His campaign was fueled by small dollar donations. Remember, he wasn't supposed to win. He was that black guy with a funny name who
And the
wasn't
big
going
ears.
in the big ears, you know, who wasn't going anywhere, but because he had that people-driven campaign, that's how he was able to do it. And not to say there's a lot of money in politics. I do think that needs to be changed. You know, after we had the shooting in Texas and all of the politicians come out with their thoughts and prayers, there's this one guy who will quote their tweet of thoughts and prayers and say, NRA gave them $300,000.
Oh, good for them.
Igor Volsky, y'all should follow him.
Yes. You know, to like point out, again, it's like his standard thoughts and prayers, but as long as the NRA is giving him that money, nothing's going to change. And people ask me all the time, particularly with gun violence prevention. I was talking, you know, earlier with some of the ladies about this. Gun violence prevention is only going to change when we get new people elected to office, because the majority of the people that are in there right now, they're not going to do anything about this. So it's incumbent upon us to make sure we're electing people who care about this, and that can be done tomorrow on Election Day.
Across the country, in a lot of places.
That's a great place.
Not just new people, but new policies and a new understanding of what this actually is. Because you mentioned that this is, to you, a country. And I personally see this more as a business. And it seems like many of the people that are in leadership positions or that fund these leaders or so-called leaders are business people. So when you come into a situation where you go to a hospital or when you go into a legal facility or even an education facility, you're dealing with people that are more interested in the business aspect. Now, the front or the face of it is, you know, whatever they claim to be, but you need to dish out money or you need to dish out some type of, you know, loan or something in order to conduct a service with that, you know, entity or company or et cetera. So that's, I just wanted to bring that up.
Thank you.
You know, in New, I hear what you're saying, and I'm not disregarding it, but in New York City, we have the ability to set an example for the country because of our great public financing system. And let's make the corporation in question there be, where do you stand on parks for softball games for kids? Because it's the softball coach who's the most important person in that district. Or it's the woman who's the mayor of the senior center, right? We have the ability to change politics locally based on that. And we know we have the great benefit of being New York. So once we fully evolve to that here, everybody else will want to follow.
Thank you again. Everybody vote. Thanks for coming.